Welcome to Laplink Connections. I'm talking today with Jan Kleijssen, who was for over 20 years a professional at the Council of Europe and dealing with a lot of issue about law and AI, etc. Well, hi, Jan, how are you?
Hi, Thomas. Thank you very much. All well. If I may just add one little word, it doesn't make me any younger, but it was actually over 40 years.
Oh.
That was with the Council of Europe, but just by the by.
Well, that's absolutely great to have you because you have been first at the Council and then an award-winning consultant with different agencies and so on. But before I start talking about AI and regulation of AI, can you perhaps briefly explain the Charter of the Council of Europe and the difference to the European Union, because I think that always gets confused.
Absolutely, Thomas. Thank you very much for that question. There's a lot of confusion, and I can tell you not only on the other side of the Atlantic, but also very much in Europe. The Council of Europe is Europe's oldest political institution. It was founded following an appeal by Winston Churchill in already 1943, repeated by Churchill in 1946. And then taken up by statesmen like Adenauer, de Gasperi, Spaak, people who post-war political giants, if you like. And the aim of the Council of Europe was to prevent the horrors from the Second World War from reoccurring. So the mandate was to protect human rights, rule of law, and democracy. And the way the Council of Europe chose to do that was through the conclusion of the preparation of internationally binding legal standards, in other words, treaties, called conventions in the Council of Europe jargon, but multilateral treaties. The European Union was set up only very shortly after the Council of Europe with the same aim, also as a stability and peace building initiative, but through economic integration. And the Council was through legal integration, if you like. And there are now some 200 treaties which were established since 1949 for Europeans. The most important one is the European Convention on Human Rights, because it provides for a court, which is also at the headquarters of the Council of Europe, and which can act on individual appeals. So in that sense, that is rather a unique system in the world, that a private citizen can take a government to an international court, and that international court can render a binding judgment, which can include an obligation to amend laws, for instance, pay compensation, of course. And that is now valid for 46 Council of Europe member states. There were 47 countries. Another big difference, by the way, with the European Union, because the European Union, as you will know, has 27 countries. The Council of Europe now has 46. I said 47. Why did I mention this? Because following Russia's aggression against Ukraine, the Council of Europe, to this day, the only international organization to have done so, expelled Russia within 3 weeks after the invasion. And as I said, the reasons are clear. For an organization that was created to protect human rights, rule of law, and democracy, of course, an aggression is intolerable. And that is why the Council is now 46 countries.
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing history and an amazing political body. Because if we compare that with U.S. politics, where it is always A or B, yeah, that's all the discussion, and the political is always in two camps. There we in the Council of Europe and also in the European Community, you work much more with consensus building and a base law, and to have so many conventions done is just amazing. But let's get a little bit more into the topic. You have worked for many years at the Council of Europe as the Director of Information Society and Action Against Crime. So totally in the topic today of AI. And you continue to consult with various agencies on the topic of AI. What is the role of the Council in regard to AI?
As I mentioned a moment ago, Thomas, the Council of Europe was set up to protect our common values in a way, human rights, rule of law, democracy, through law. it realized very early on that new technological developments would have a huge impact, for instance, on human rights and also on rule of law and democracy. 40 years ago, the Council of Europe established a treaty on data protection. And that came at a time, 40 years ago, when there was virtually no country in the world, seems very bizarre now, but at the time, there was virtually no country in the world that had any data protection legislation at all. And therefore, this convention was really a pioneering instrument that influenced national legislation, not only in Europe, but throughout the world. This particular convention on data protection now has 55 state parties, so more than Council of Europe member states. And there are some 30 observer states as well from really all over the world. Even more successful is the Council of Europe's Convention Against Cybercrime. Again, it's now 21 years old. 21 years ago, it became clear that increasingly organized crime was abusing the opportunities of the internet, of all these wonderful new technologies that were being developed. And the Council of Europe therefore established a treaty to fight cybercrime, to enable cooperation between countries, to set up rapid response mechanisms. That treaty now has 68 state parties, including, I should say, the United States and Canada, both, but also, for instance, Brazil and Nigeria, Australia, but also countries like Sri Lanka, the Philippines. On all 5 continents, there are parties. So AI is dealing with AI is in a way a logical further step, a very powerful technology that brings many benefits, but as we know, also carries significant risks, and hence the interest of the Council of Europe to work also at the moment on a convention as regards artificial intelligence and human rights.
Yes, I mean, of course, AI right now, for the last 6 months, is the hottest topic in technology, and everybody engaged in it. And as you already mentioned, the Council has released a so-called Zero Draft Convention on AI, Human Rights, Democracy, and the Rule of Law. Is this convention going forward enough of a framework to regulate AI? If not, what else is needed?
I think it is at the moment the best option we have for a global instrument. The European Union is the smaller organization I referred to earlier, right? Our sister organization, if you like, the smaller sister, is already well advanced with a regulation that's an internal, so that's internal law that applies only to the members of the organization, but very detailed, which takes a risk-based approach. It started its life as a market regulation to ensure there were safe products. The original proposal, a number of guarantees for citizens have now been added. And this now becomes a bit technical, but it is now being negotiated between the three bodies that make up the European Union, the Commission on the one hand, the European Parliament, and the member states, the Council of the European Union, not to be confused with the Council of Europe. And that should see the light by the end of the day. And it's going to be extremely useful for 27 countries. For a global instrument, the Council of Europe Treaty is currently being negotiated by 52 states, the 46 member states, and the 5 observers, which are the United States, Canada, Japan, Mexico, and the Holy See, and the government of Israel, which on an ad hoc basis has asked whether it could join these negotiations. The negotiations are making good progress. The original aim, however, to have the treaty ready by the end of this year will not be possible. Also because a certain amount of coordination with the European Union is taking place, more than a certain amount. The 27 members of the Union negotiate en bloc, as you like, as one group within the 52. And of course, since their negotiations still underway, what we would want to avoid, of course, is if there were two diverging interpretations, diverging definitions. So the Council of Europe has decided to postpone until April the adoption of the conclusion of its own work, so that by then the European Union's work will have been finalized, and that can then be taken on board. Doesn't necessarily have to be copied, but it's important to know what's in it, so that the other states can then consider to what extent they want to adapt the treaty take on, for instance, the same definition as the European Union. That's one of the options at the moment, which as a consultant personally, would make a lot of sense. If there would be one definition that everyone could adhere to. So that's what's happening. Negotiations underway until April. If you allow me, Thomas, another remark perhaps that is interesting for the viewers is it's not just states around the table. Industry is also there. There are 28 companies or associations of companies that are sitting at the table. Those that have signed a digital partnership agreement with the Council of Europe, and NGOs are there as well. And I myself am now in the same committee, no longer as a director, but as a representative of a Dutch foundation called ALLAI, ALLAI, which strives for responsible and transparent use of artificial intelligence.
Yeah, no, that all makes sense. I think it's totally right that if you have a big bloc like the European Union that also is mandatory for the states, for the member states, then you want that bloc fully in the center, of their own convention. Otherwise, it would never carry if it's, divergent.
Exactly.
And I mean, it's a big undertaking. I'm glad to hear that there are also NGOs and businesses, part of it. But let's take perhaps the tack of perhaps some of the critics, who, and it might only be some, that will argue that any restriction on AI and social media is in conflict with the Council's own expression right of freedom of expression, free transboundary flow of information on the internet. How does that coexist in your mind?
Yes, so that's an absolutely fair question. In Europe, the freedom of expression is always, and that's actually contrary to the US tradition on freedom of expression. There are limits admissible under European law. The European Convention on Human Rights, I mentioned, guarantees freedom of expression. But there is an Article 2 which provides that under particular circumstances, very strict circumstances, and which have to be validated by a court, ultimately by the European Court of Human Rights, governments may restrict such liberty. And that has, for instance, been the case with regard to hate speech, with regard to calls for violence, and very much the same, I think, would apply to AI. AI is very powerful technology, and it can bring many benefits. And I would certainly, when I speak about regulation, want to stress first and foremost that I really do believe that these benefits will be considerable. But they will be considerable only if we if we govern the technology well. In my own country, sadly, and this is one of the most flagrant use cases of what can go wrong if even with the best of intentions AI is used by government, for instance. I'll give you a very short summary. The Dutch tax authorities wanted to fight fraud, legitimate aim, and especially fraud with regard to family allowances, child benefits. In order to detect such fraud, they used an AI system. But unfortunately, the AI system used highly biased data. It used data, it used nationality as a criterion. It used residence addresses, so particular neighborhoods, and a series of other parameters which had absolutely nothing to do with the actual probability that someone would or would not commit fraud. The result of this was that up to 35,000 people were identified as having defrauded the system, and later it was admitted that more than 95% of these had never committed any fraud. These people were forced to pay back not only the benefits they had received over the part of the recent months, but what they had received over years. That meant that people who were on an absolute minimum income suddenly had to pay tens of thousands of euros back in a short time. There were suicides. 3,000 children were taken away from their families. The government fell. The courts that were asked to look into it displayed what is often called automation bias, but which perhaps is better described as cognitive shutdown. The computer said it was okay. It was an AI system. So who are we judges to challenge that? So it was an absolute tragedy, which is ongoing because the children still have not been returned. And it was because the AI system was not governed. The data sets had not been tested. There was no human oversight. The judges, the judiciary was not trained, didn't know what questions to ask. The data sets were not recorded. They were highly biased. So a whole series of issues arose. And I think it is extremely important that we keep in mind that so even with the best of intentions, and that's why I'm giving this example, it's not that a criminal gang was using it. We're obvious with the aim to harm. No, it was a government that was actually trying to protect taxpayers' money, and it led to this tragedy. I find another example recently. ChatGPT and similar systems have made a lot of headlines. In Belgium, there's been a very sad case where a competitor to ChatGPT, a similar chatbot, had a dialogue with a depressed young man and recommended suicide, which unfortunately the person followed up. And so that was obviously something that should have been tested. So when I speak about regulation, it is not to hamper innovation. Take pharmaceuticals. The pharmaceutical industry is probably the most regulated industry in the world, and yet it is also one of the most innovative. I'm firmly convinced that good regulation makes for good innovation, but products should be tested. When you buy a new car, Thomas, or a bit of equipment, major equipment, I see these wonderful buildings behind you. They are tested, right? There are standards, and that is usually done cars are tested first of all on a closed circuit by the manufacturer, and so are other products. With AI, unfortunately, we are the laboratory. Society is the laboratory.
Right.
And that is, in fact, both the European Union text and the Council of Europe text call for, I'll stop there, but just to give a bit of the picture, for instance, regulatory sandboxes before you test a product on society, including on children, because this Belgian, I think he was even a minor, with potentially devastating circumstances, test it in a closed environment under government supervision, as you do for any other product. So why should AI be different?
Yeah, but it's a difficult debate because very clearly in the whole AI, or let's say the modern AI era, that started with ChatGPT, because we haven't talked that much in public about AI in the last 15 years. AI was always used, but mostly big data sets. It's what comes in comes out, and with ChatGPT, for the first time, people thought, oh, the truth, it's the real facts come out. And from very early on, everybody warned that it has to be trained and it's not always right and it has to be monitored. And so the question always is, what can, the industries do and regulate themselves? You posted recently that industry do not set their own rules, and neither should AI firms. But why not? It seems that government, although you make the case for the contrary, it seems that government has been notorious behind when it comes to understanding, monitoring, regulating new innovations. And I go back to the last big innovation, that was the internet, where so much politics happened of, oh, let's not have the internet, let's not do that because of the negative side. And on the other hand, today we have so much innovation because of the internet, so much more benefits. And so, why not have some of, the AI companies that are at the forefront always suggest, what they want to have in innovation? What's different here?
Well, I think first of all, there is the use of the internet itself is still governed by law. The European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, the European Court in Strasbourg have held that as far as Europe is concerned, for instance, what applies offline also applies online. So, for instance, hate speech, calls for violence on the internet are just as punishable as calls in the press or by any other, in the written press or by any other means. I mentioned the Data Protection Convention. We have the internet, but we the GDPR applies, as you know, in Europe. The Convention 108, the one I mentioned for the Council of Europe, applies in 55 countries. We have set limits on the use of the internet with regard to privacy. Very, very strict rules. Cybercrime is another one. Committing crime through a computer network is a crime. And computer networks actually, and this was established by the parties, also include the devices such as mobile phones, etc. So there are already strict rules. When I say that companies should not set their own rules, it is good that there are ethical guidelines that companies apply. But ultimately, a citizen cannot obtain a legal remedy on the basis of self-regulation by companies. If someone is the victim of a faulty AI system, then and goes to a judge in order to seek a remedy, the judge will need law in order to apply. He cannot apply the charter of ethics that a certain company has. It's good that companies try to mitigate. With regard to the risk of AI, Thomas, I think there are basically two major issues. Well, three. First of all, try to maximize the benefits from AI, of course, but at the same time, number two, mitigate the risks as much as you can. And that's why I mentioned, for instance, these regulatory sandboxes. Test the stuff before you roll it out on society, as I said, as you would do with any other powerful technology. But third, even with the best of intentions, things will still go wrong. And as I said, the Dutch case is an example where with very good intentions, something went rather dramatically wrong. And then, of course, there must be remedies. There must be redress, and that redress can only, in the end, in the final analysis, be offered through legal guarantees. And that's where you will then have a court interpreting what will happen. There's a case which was decided yesterday on facial recognition, for instance, in Strasbourg, where the court set rather strict criteria for facial recognition if used by governments, for instance. So if state authorities use facial recognition, they will have to comply with a number of requirements. So as I said, I don't think this in any way hampers innovation. On the contrary, because if you have rules, companies know where to operate. If the rules apply globally, you have a level playing field globally. Because if there were going to be no global treaties, then you will see that as soon as something goes wrong, individual countries would start to legislate in response to a public outcry, for instance, which would then lead to very different rules applying in different parts of the world. I think that would be not good for citizens, but also not good for companies.
Yeah, no, I think that you make a fair point here. That if you want to have conflict resolution, you need to have some laws that apply. Now, in Europe, it's mostly codified law. In the US, it's case law. So it's a little bit different. I think that I look as a European, I look very much to the European Union to say, well, they do perhaps a better job than perhaps here in the US, where the legal system is totally different. And, we have a lot of problems in social media to do that. And not always, as you say, you get it right. I had a funny case happened to me when I went through the border in Canada, and they now have facial recognition. And it's absolutely fantastic. You go to the machine and it says, "Hi, Thomas." They already recognized me and said, "Okay, now put your face in the circle and take your picture." And so I tried that, and it says, "Didn't work. Please take off your mask." And I said, "Well, I don't have a mask." So I tried it again. And so after 3 tries, the computer gave up and they sent me to the next thing. Yeah, the mask was on, and so they couldn't recognize that.
Well, but of course, Thomas, if I may just give you a point, of course, there have been big issues with facial recognition by people who look slightly different from the two of us, who are not of, say, white Caucasian background, where obvious cases of discrimination have resulted, for instance, when law enforcement in the US tested AI on probation, for instance, and on facial recognition. And all sorts of highly discriminatory practices came out because of the data sets on which the AI was trained. Of course, AI doesn't have any feelings of its own, but if the data is very biased or very is narrow in a way, in including certain images only, then you will get also get the bad results. One more sentence, if I may, on your previous question, is that you mentioned the companies. Something I think we should bear in mind is that we're in a rather unique situation, because there are actually only a few companies that hold all the threats on this together, and they've been very good in buying all startups that actually could, in one way or another, put a challenge to their virtual monopolies. In Leiden, I used the following phrase, and you'll forgive me for paraphrasing Winston Churchill, but I think it is rather apt, that actually never in the field of human development has so much power over so many been held by so few. The big players have enormous influence because of the data they hold, because of the technology they master. And I would sleep more soundly if I knew that, as in any system, there were checks and balances to ensure that power could not be abused.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Certainly there can always be different perspectives, because one would say, yeah, if the big companies set up very strong limitations of the use, that will dwarf innovation from the little companies that are now coming up. Because what happens right now is that, yes, ChatGPT and its competitors is all done by the big companies. But there are thousands and thousands of new companies being created right now that go in different directions. And of course, they don't want to be hampered in any way. But I agree that we need to have a normal playing field that doesn't hurt anybody, that plays by human rights, etc., non-discrimination, and that's absolutely necessary. Let me touch on one last topic that is very dear to me: copyright. And probably to you now, you're working with the universities, so whatever you produce is copyright. How can intellectual work be protected in light of ChatGPT-like creations? Whether it's in academia, journalism, literature, or software publishing, it seems that it is very hard now to protect perhaps copyrights because ChatGPT does not know what it is. So what's your view on that?
No, I fully share your concern, Thomas, with regard to copyright, and also with regard to an annex issue I already mentioned, namely privacy, because ChatGPT scrapes the internet. It scrapes text, it scrapes images as well. It scrapes images that actually also images that are protected by copyright, artists' work, paintings, all sorts of images, architects' work, what have you. And as you quite rightly observe, it never acknowledges its source. It doesn't. Not only doesn't it honor the copyright, it doesn't even attribute what it refers to its customer. It doesn't even mention the source. So that is a big issue. I know there's litigation in California underway at the moment against OpenAI with regard to copyright, with regard to ChatGPT, using both text and images without any acknowledgement of the intellectual property rights that pertain to these texts and or images. No, this is huge, and this is also why I think that it is necessary to have regulation. And as I said, regulation is not done behind the back of the companies. I mentioned at the Council of Europe, there are 28, and they're all the big Americans, for instance, and associations of smaller Europeans, also associations of SMEs, which are there, not, by the way, not only European, also worldwide. So they have a say, and they're involved in the process. But it is important that these new technologies do not, in a way, ignore well-established legal principles, because copyright is there for a reason. It's not just to make people rich. It's there for a reason, a very good reason. And allowing these systems to use these images without any acknowledgement, I think raises huge issues. It will be very interesting to see what the California courts will decide now, because I think that will also be a very important indicator for European lawmakers.
Yeah, it's quite a problem when I think of a school or journalism or literature, and it's how do you check on these things? I mean, probably the industry will react in a sense that we will get chatbots that will check whether it was created by ChatGPT or similar situations, so that you can run it through kind of copyright protected material and see what comes out of it.
One example, if I may, Thomas, actually, because that is something we're discussing in Strasbourg, is the acknowledgement of the data sets. That the data sets must be transparent. So a company, when challenged, should be able to indicate on what data set a particular system was trained. And if these data sets include copyright material under copyright, there would then be a liability.
Right. Yeah. I also saw just the other day from my home country, the state of Hesse or Hessen, with Frankfurt in the middle there. The Ministry of Education issued a guidance on AI, which I thought was very intelligent, very balanced, and were mostly about educate the children about it, about the benefits, how to use it, how to also prompt it, and they were taking the thing is, if you use ChatGPT or similar, then the same as you make a footnote, you have to make the footnote and says, okay, which was your prompt, what did you use, and what was the outcome of it. Well, it's a little bit more than just a footnote, or where you said, oh yeah, I read on page 59 of Churchill, blah blah blah. But it's a right way to do it, and I thought that was a very good paper that they published to the schools. I was very impressed, because usually, as I said, I've been so long in technology, and it seems always that government has a hard time following so quickly on new innovation. But there's now so much in the center of society that we see that the governments will act a little faster. And I applaud the Council of Europe to take all these steps. I think they're absolutely necessary to provide the guidance where innovation hurts people, and that can't be the case. So Jan, thank you so much. I really appreciated your wisdom on this and your work on this. I'm sure we will perhaps have a talk at some later stage and see what has been achieved and what we can do. But it's certainly fast moving. It's a lot of money involved. It will have great impact on society in productivity, and so we'll see how we can make it safer without hindering its development. Thank you so much, Jan, and talk to you soon.
Thank you very much, Thomas.